Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming to tonight's public lecture from the Psychedelic Experience Clinic. It's great to be back with these events, which are now going to be free to the public. It helps us spread awareness of the clinical service that we offer, which is, of course, low-cost psychoanalytic psychotherapy for those looking for support after a psychedelic experience, and to allow more psychoanalytic ideas to permeate the psychedelic studies space and vice versa. We're also happy to announce that we've expanded somewhat by bringing on some more psychotherapists and are beginning a second study group together. So if you'd be interested in getting involved, please contact us and we'll put you on the list of interested parties for if or when we expand again. And please do share word about the service too. We're pleased to be joined tonight by CJ Healy, PhD, for his talk, New Beginning, a Balintian account of psychedelic healing. And it's been a long time coming. I think we first planned this a year ago and technical difficulties stopped it from happening. The talk is being recorded, so yeah, please do remain muted during the presentation and we'll make time afterwards for questions and discussion. You can either put it in the chat or you can raise your hand and I'll ask you to unmute. So now I'll introduce our friend CJ before we begin the presentation. CJ Healy is a clinical psychologist in New York. Dr. Healy is training faculty and trainer at Fluence, a member of the advisory board and organizing committee of the Sandow Ferenczi Center, and a member of the trainee editorial board of the academic journal Psychedelic Medicine. Dr. Healy was a recipient of a Source Award from the Source Research Foundation Source Awards in 2022 for original psychedelic research, a fellowship from the Columbia University Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research in 2021 to 22, a Scholars Award from the Society for Psychoanalysis and Psychoanalytic Psychology, APA Division 39, in 2023-24, and an Outstanding Graduate Student Award from the New School for Social Research in 2024 for conceptualizing, developing, and teaching the course Psychedelics and Psychology, the university's first course on psychedelic science in the field of psychology. Dr. Healy is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Flatiron Center for Psychotherapy. So whenever you're ready, CJ, please do go ahead.
All right, cool. Thanks, Timmy. And hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Before I just jump into reading the paper, or an abridged version of it anyway, I'll just say a few quick comments on sort of how the paper came about, which is that I was reading, this is some years ago now, but I was reading The Basic Fault by Michael Balint and was really struck by what seemed to me to be formal similarities between his descriptions of perinatal mental states in the fetus and the newborn infant and psychedelic mystical experiences. And so this paper is sort of, I guess, an elaboration and extrapolation of laying out those formal similarities, both in terms of how Balint's ideas might illuminate understanding a model of what's happening in the mind in psychedelic mystical experiences, and then also clinically how these experiences might prove therapeutic in a psychodynamic situation. Yeah, so that said, I will just go ahead and jump in, and hopefully there will be some time at the end for questions and discussion. All right, psychedelic therapy first emerged as a method of drug-assisted psychotherapy in the 1950s with the introduction of mescaline and LSD into Western psychiatry. Psychoanalysts and psychoanalytically oriented clinicians and scientists investigated the effects of psychedelics on various personal and interpersonal factors and processes involved in psychoanalytic treatments, such as conflict, resistance, transference, free association, defenses, personality, ego integrity, memory, fantasy, regression, and abreaction. Salient and frequently noted phenomena were an intensification of the transference-countertransference, a significant relaxation of resistance, the weakening and simplification, meaning in a primitive direction, of defenses, partial or total disintegration of the ego, facilitation of introspection and insight, marked regression in mental and behavioral functioning to earlier states of development, and the recovery and immersive reliving of repressed childhood memories, followed by cathartic abreaction. The remarkable clinical potential of psychedelics and the nature of the psychological mechanisms by which they affect therapeutic change have broad implications for the form and delivery of psychiatric treatment and psychotherapy, including psychoanalysis. In light of the empirical and theoretical advances that were made in the mid-century phase of psychedelic research and that continue to be made by contemporary clinicians and scientists, there have been increasing efforts to elucidate a robust and coherent theoretical account of the therapeutic mechanisms of action of psychedelics. Psychoanalytic theory, because of its rich engagement with processes of psychical regression that occur in psychotherapy, is singularly well suited for the effort to elaborate a psychodynamic account of psychedelic healing. This paper aims to do that through the lens of the work of Michael Balint, with particular focus on the ideas regarding psychic structure and therapeutic process that he proposes in his 1968 book, The Basic Fault. I propose that psychedelics have the special capacity to reliably provoke benign regression to the infantile state of what Balint calls primary love, allowing for deficits at the level of what Balint calls the basic fault to be worked through in the transference-countertransference. To begin with, I briefly review Balint's intellectual heritage as well as the contemporary psychoanalytic milieu within which he was writing. This overview is followed by a description of the phenomenology of psychedelic mystical states and of their clinical relevance to psychoanalytic practice. And I continue with a close reading of the basic fault with attention on the theoretical theses, clinical observations, and case descriptions that bear relevance to the understanding of intrapsychic and interpsychic processes in psychedelic therapy. From this close reading, I propose a Balintian account of the nature of the curative action of psychedelic mystical experiences. And then I'll conclude with brief comments regarding technical implications of this theoretical framework. So a little bit on Balint's intellectual heritage and the intellectual milieu in which he was working. Reading and interpreting the work of Balint requires contextualizing his thought in terms of both his psychoanalytic lineage and the theoretical currents that were emerging at the time that he was writing and practicing as an analyst. Balint situated himself as a member of the middle group during the controversial discussions that took place in the British Psychoanalytical Society between the followers of Anna Freud and Melanie Klein in the early 40s. Though he diverged from Klein in some important respects, such as by denying the presence of hatred, anxiety, or aggression in early infancy, like Klein, he devoted much of his work to describing early pregenital states and processes while also attempting to maintain fundamental allegiance to classical Freudian theory and metapsychology. Despite his significant departures from orthodox classical theory, Balint was nevertheless in many respects a Freudian, and he, like Klein, seems implicitly to frame his work as an extension and progression of, rather than a rupture with, the Freudian project. That is, as well within the Freudian tradition, even when stretching it considerably. But as much as he was a Freudian, Balint must be equally understood as a Ferencian. Shortly after completing his medical training, Balint attended Ferenczi's inaugural lectures as the first chair of psychoanalysis in Hungary in 1919, and later entered analysis with Ferenczi in 1924. After Ferenczi's death, Balint was also one of the main collectors of Ferenczi's papers and letters, including his correspondence with Freud and his clinical diary, the latter of which Balint would later contribute to translating into English. Balint's loyalty to Ferenczi and his legacy, therefore, was likely as personal as it was professional. A significant implicit thrust and pervasive undercurrent of the basic fault is Balint's earnest effort to reconcile, and perhaps we can say to heal, the profound rift that emerged between the ideas of Freud and those of the late Ferenczi, especially as they concern the questions of trauma in early childhood, the effects of the actual analyst on the patient and on the transference countertransference, versus fantasies of the analyst, for example, and the appropriate role of regression and the analyst's responses to it in psychoanalytic treatment. In addition to the essential influences of Freud and Ferenczi, Balint was also critically influenced by emerging thought regarding the ego. In the work of Anna Freud, Heinz Hartmann, Donald Winnicott, and others, there's increased attention to reality-oriented ego functions, processes of adaptation to reality, and the effects of the real environment, including objects such as the mother or the analyst in the analytic situation, on development, psychic structure, and psychoanalytic process. Balint cites Anna Freud's notion of the need-satisfying object, Hartmann's notion of the average expectable environment, Winnicott's notions of the holding function of the mother and of the facilitating environment in his discussion of the primitive, harmonious object relationship that may emerge between the patient and analyst when the analyst responds appropriately to the patient's regression, which is an idea we'll get much more into. And so a prominent current of psychoanalytic thought at the time that Balint was developing his ideas concerned the role of the real environment and the objects in the real environment, both in early mental development and in the psychoanalytic situation. All right, so turning now to the psychedelic mystical experience. So before more closely examining Balint's ideas regarding psychic development and structure, and consequently regarding the theory and technique of psychoanalytic treatment, a description of the phenomenology and neurobiology of psychedelic mystical states that expands on the observations introduced above will help contextualize the discussion that follows in terms of its relevance for understanding the mechanisms of psychedelic therapy. In contrast to the mid-century focus described above on the psychodynamic effects of psychedelics when administered in the context of psychotherapy, such as effects on defenses, transference, etc., contemporary clinical studies of psychedelic therapy have tended to emphasize their facility in occasioning mystical type experiences marked by a profound sense of unity and interconnectedness with all people and things, the subjective transcendence of time and space, and feelings of joy, peace, awe, and love. Experiences of this type, which are often called transpersonal, and bearing the implication that they might exceed psychodynamic explanation, were also observed, of course, in the mid-century phase of psychedelic research as well. One writer noted that in contrast to low doses of LSD that facilitate the activation and deepening of the psychoanalytic process by producing symbolic dream images, regressions, and transference phenomena, high doses of LSD lead to, quote, so-called cosmic mystic experiences in which oneness and ecstatic joy are attained. Another writer describes transcendental experiences such as, quote, floating in space, being in the presence of God, being at peace with everybody, being spiritually reborn. And this writer reports many therapists believe that a transcendental experience, a feeling that it is a good world and that one is a part of it, is a curative experience in itself. The psychedelic mystical experience centrally involves ego loss, which comprises not just dissolution of ideas of the self, one's identity or individuality, one's sense of being a person with a name, a history, likes and dislikes, a career, etc., but also and more profoundly, dissolution of the essential boundary between the self and the world, loss of the implicit self, the implicit sense of being an ontologically separate being. That is, of being a subject that is distinct from the objects of its perception. leaving behind a vast and deep experience of union with reality itself, of the oneness and essential continuity of all things, a sense not of being in the world, but of being the world, or a sense of the world as being, in which the interpenetration of the self and the world is so fundamental as to make the two absolutely indistinguishable. In both clinical and naturalistic studies of psychedelic use, the mystical or mystical type experience, or the experience of ego dissolution, has robustly and consistently been found to be the psychological experience acutely occasioned by psychedelics that most commonly mediates both immediate and long-term therapeutic outcomes, scientifically establishing the enduring therapeutic value of the acute mystical states that psychedelics can reliably occasion. The following passages are quotations from participants in clinical trials of psychedelic-assisted therapy regarding the kinds of mystical experiences they had during their psychedelic sessions. One woman with a history of kidney cancer reported regarding her psilocybin experience, quote, "I had no doubt I was in the presence of the infinite because I felt an overriding peacefulness that carried me through everything. I had a sense of losing my observer. I no longer witnessed the images, I was becoming them. There was a sense of being engulfed." Another man with lung cancer reported, quote, "Gradually my experience of a higher plane of consciousness deepened and was associated with a gradual change of my vision from a fabric connecting all of our consciousnesses to all of our consciousnesses being together as a unified consciousness in a warm, enclosed space, almost like a womb." Another woman reported of her LSD experience, quote, "Oneness, all one, in Godness, indescribable, utmost, emotionless, no self, no sensations. Self was within and without, time gone, space gone, nowhere but infinitely everywhere, no time but eternally now, no wholly other or beyond, but in it, in the infinite, in the eternal and infinite, in mystery, part of it, all one. This seemed in eternity or in no time." These representative selections capture the subjective experience of the dissolution of the ego and of all boundaries or differentiation between self and world, and the subsequent experience of an essential unity and oneness with all of reality. The theoretical hypothesis of this paper is that the essential psychical action of psychedelics is to dissolve the boundaries of the ego, which includes both internal boundaries between the ego and warded off parts of the mind, and external boundaries between the ego and the environment, and that the dissolution of ego boundaries engenders functional regression to infantile or even prenatal psychical states prior to the development of the unity of the ego, which are marked by a lack of subjective distinction between inner and outer realities. This primary experience of oceanic unity with the environment is what characterizes the psychedelic mystical experience. Building on this regression hypothesis, I argue that Balint's theory of primary love, which he introduced as an alternative to Freud's concept of primary narcissism, and I'll discuss this development more later, that his theory of primary love provides a theoretically coherent and clinically vital metapsychological model for explaining the psychical nature of the psychedelic mystical experience and subsequently of the therapeutic action of such experiences. The idea that psychedelics dissolve the boundaries of the ego and thereby can occasion mystical states of consciousness, the blissful total phenomenological loss of subject-object differentiation and the experience of essential unity between self and world, strongly suggests that such psychedelic mystical states are the result of functional regression to a primitive psychical state or phase prior to the development of the unity of the ego. This suggestion is further strengthened by a number of other widely replicated clinical observations regarding the acute effects of psychedelics, including the weakening and simplification of defenses, the amplification and intensification of the transference, and the emergence of childlike or infantile behaviors and thought processes, such as primary process thinking. These mystical states occasioned by psychedelics have a striking descriptive identity with the infantile psychical state prior to the development of the unity of the ego that Balint calls primary love. This descriptive identity positions Balint's theory as an especially compelling one for accounting for the nature of the psychedelic experience. If we accept the explanatory power of Balint's theory regarding the metapsychology of psychedelic mystical states, then it is sound to suppose that his arguments regarding the clinical utility of such regressed states, as well as his technical recommendations regarding working with them, might apply well to psychedelic therapy, including the potential use of psychedelics in psychoanalytic treatment. So now to turn to a close reading of the basic fault. So keeping in mind, on the one hand, the intellectual lineage and milieu from and within which Balint developed his theories, and on the other hand, the nature of the profoundly regressed states and experiences that psychedelics can occasion, I turn now to a close reading of Balint's 1968 book, The Basic Fault. This section lays the requisite foundation for the following section, in which I construct a Balintian account of the therapeutic mechanisms of psychedelic therapy. Balint basically proposes two primary theses in The Basic Fault. First, that certain symptoms and other phenomena that arise in psychoanalytic treatment, especially those that seem to be uniquely intractable or that give rise to exceptional difficulties in the treatment, result not from Oedipal conflict, but from a non-conflictual basic fault in the patient's psyche. And second, that the factor of the psychoanalytic situation by which this basic fault is amenable to change is not interpretation, but the object relationship between the patient and the analyst. And over the course of the book, Balint carefully details his arguments for each of these two theses. Describing the basic fault. Balint chose the word fault to describe the dynamic, non-conflictual feature of the patient's psyche that gives rise to what he noticed to be unique difficulties in the psychoanalytic situation. In geology, the word fault refers to a break that profoundly disrupts the overall structure. Although highly dynamic, the basic fault, in contrast to the dynamic nature of Oedipal conflict, is not something dammed up that must be discharged, but something missing. It's not an impulse that can be satisfied or a conflict that can be solved, but a deficiency that can perhaps be healed with the necessary provision of what is lacking, but healed with a defect, like a scar. The basic fault, Balint suggests, is only partly reversible. Balint argues that the basic fault is the result of a lack of fit between the child and the objects who constitute the child's environment. This lack of fit represents a pathogenic discrepancy between the child's needs and the material and psychological care, attention, and affection the child receives. Balint notes that the discrepancy may be due to congenital or biological or constitutional factors of the child. For example, constitutional factors that might cause the child's needs to be excessive or unrealistic, or due to environmental factors, such as caregivers who are indifferent, careless, negligent, or even hostile. Later, Balint expands on the developmental origins and pathological sequelae of the basic fault, and it's here that the word trauma is introduced as the essential pathogenic factor in the development of the basic fault. This pathogenic trauma, he notes, is not necessarily a single event, but rather is usually a situation of some duration of a painful lack of fit between the child and her environment. and by environment, he specifically means the world of the child's adult objects. As a result of prolonged traumatic experiences with indifferent, careless, negligent, or hostile objects, the child's development is fundamentally influenced or imprinted by the methods she develops for coping with the effects of the trauma. These maladaptive coping methods are precisely what the basic fault comprises. These coping methods are, Balint notes, invariably costly and above all alien to the child, and they are incorporated into her ego structure as her basic fault. Anything beyond or contrary to these coping methods strike her as frightening and more or less impossible. Analytic treatment consists in dealing with the fears and fixations obstructing the way to readaptation to current reality and, quote, enabling the patient to broaden her potentialities and develop new methods for coping with her difficulties. Excuse me. In some cases, Balint suggests it is necessary for the patient to regress to the pre-traumatic period and to relive the trauma in order to mobilize her fixated libido and, quote, find new possibilities for dealing with the problems involved. Balint spends the next few chapters painstakingly reviewing and critiquing Freud's theories of primary object relationship, autoerotism, and primary narcissism, and the inherent contradictions between these three theories regarding the child's earliest and most primitive libidinal relationship with the environment. I won't review these chapters in detail. Suffice it to say that through close readings of Freud, as well as through clinical observations of a variety of what he calls narcissistic conditions and states, such as deep sleep, schizophrenia, alcoholism and other addictions, so-called disorders of narcissism, as well as antenatal and postnatal states, Balint comes to the conclusion that all the psychological and clinical phenomena that had previously been cited as evidence of a state of um, primary narcissism in Freudian terms, referring specifically to the state in which all libido is cathected or concentrated in the ego or some other self-structure, leaving the environment and external objects entirely uncathected. Balint suggests that these states are more accurately understood as instances of secondary narcissism, states in which there's been a withdrawal of libido toward the ego or some other self-structure in the face of environmental frustration. And so having thus refuted the theory of primary narcissism, Balint proceeds to posit his alternative theory of a primary relationship to the environment that he calls primary love. He argues that in antenatal states, that is in the womb, the fetus and the mother environment exist in a state of undifferentiated, interpenetrating, quote, harmonious mix-up, a relationship of exactly the same nature, he says, as, quote, our relationship to the air surrounding us. There are not yet objects in this environment, and there are no boundaries, including between self and environment. The environment of the womb, he says, is, quote, a kind of unstructured ocean. The relationship between fetus and mother environment is marked by an intense libidinal cathexis. Quote, the individual is born in a state of intense relatedness to his environment, both biologically and libidinally. So to pause in my reading, just to clarify exactly the distinction Balint's making, Freud's theory of primary narcissism, what he says is the earliest psychical position of the infant is that the libido is entirely cathected in the ego. Balint is saying that there is a phase of psychic development prior to the development of the ego where it's truly the environment that's entirely cathected with libido, but it's not cathected as an object. There's no distinction whatsoever between self and environment. It's simply one kind of oceanic flux of libido. Um, so I'll briefly pause in my close reading of the basic fault to address some relevant and broader implications of the theory of primary love, as well as of Balint's descriptions of the phenomenology of the phase or state of primary love. In On Narcissism, Freud writes, quote, "A unity comparable to the ego cannot exist in the individual from the start. The ego has to be developed. And so it follows logically, even though Freud never says this explicitly, that the phase of primary narcissism must chronologically be later than this earliest period in which the ego has not yet begun to develop. Later in Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud suggests that this earliest, most primitive, unbounded period of limitlessness in which there is not yet a differentiation of subject and object or of internal and external is characterized by what he calls an oceanic feeling, a feeling of, quote, being one with the external world as a whole and of, quote, a bond with the universe. Freud's descriptions of this oceanic and unbounded state are indistinguishable, both from Balint's descriptions of the state of primary love and, crucially for the present paper, descriptions of psychedelic mystical states, as described above. It might be the case that in positing a phase of primary love, Balint is not, in fact, offering a corrective to the theory of primary narcissism, which is what he says he's doing, but rather he might be elaborating the psychical and libidinal conditions of the individual prior to the development of the unity of the ego. And so it follows then that psychedelic mystical experiences, which mechanistically involve a total disintegration or dissolution of the ego, would regress the individual to this primitive state of oceanic boundlessness, of harmonious mix-up with the universe. So to return to the basic fault, for Balint, birth, which he calls a trauma, sets off and accelerates processes of separation and differentiation between the baby and her environment. And this trauma enforces a new form of adaptation. Objects, both in the environment and the ego, begin to emerge, and their boundaries quickly begin to congeal. Libido, which formerly had been in a state of homogeneous flux, begins to concentrate. Narcissistic withdrawal of libido to the ego is an effort to recover the harmony of the womb in the face of painful contrasts with that prior state of harmony. Narcissistic cathexis of the ego, therefore, is secondary to the original primary cathexis of the environment, the feeling of oneness of the fetus and her mother environment. Gratifying objects in the postnatal environment retain some of the original primary cathexis of the environment and therefore become what Balint calls primary objects, with whom the baby exists in a primitive two-person relationship. Prototypical primary objects, Balint argues, include the baby's mother, as well as the four elements of water, earth, fire, and water. And Balint argues that during analytic treatment, the analyst at times assumes in the transference-countertransference the qualities of a primary object, whether mother or sometimes element. And the emergence of this primary object relationship between patient and analyst during treatment and its curative potential is going to be discussed further in a little bit. Balint later asserts that quote, the ultimate aim of all libidinal striving, the desire of all humanity, is the preservation or restoration of the original harmony, the reestablishment of the harmonious interpenetrating mix-up between the individual and the most important parts of his environment, his love objects. He quotes Annie Reich's description of an ecstatic state of unio mystica, which she compares to Freud's oceanic feeling. Quote, the flowing together of self and world, of self and primary object, It has to do with a temporary relinquishment of the separating boundaries. And then Balint names three possibilities in adult life for achieving this ultimate aim of the state of unio mystica: religious ecstasy, sublime moments of artistic creation, and certain regressive periods during analytic treatment. We might now add a fourth: the psychedelic mystical experience. While some patients see satisfactory therapeutic results without regression beyond the Oedipal level, others, as has been described, require primitive regression to the level of the basic fault. The psychoanalytic situation, Balint notes, is already set up to encourage regression and facilitate communication of a primitive intensity through acting out, such as through screaming, muscular or other motor activity, or unregulated affective expression. In response to these forms of primitive nonverbal communication, the analyst, he says, must communicate her understanding. Indeed, how the analyst responds to the patient's acting out critically affects the atmosphere, that's his word, the atmosphere of the consulting room. Whether to welcome, promote, and encourage further regression, or to forestall, reverse, prevent, or prohibit it. The implication of this observation is that regression is not a strictly intrapsychic phenomenon. In the two-person psychoanalytic situation, the analyst and the patient each contributes to the emergence of regressive processes. If the analyst, Balint argues, can find ways to respond appropriately to the patient's regression, an opportunity is opened for the healing of the patient's basic fault. Balint calls this process, quote, regression for the sake of progression. In short, regressing to a primitive state before the development of the basic fault may allow for the discovery of new, better suited methods of coping with the traumatic difficulties that caused the basic fault. He calls this a new beginning. Balint emphasizes that new beginnings occur within the transference-countertransference, that is, in the object relationship between the patient and the analyst. He argues that in order to create an atmosphere in the transference-countertransference conducive to the development of new beginnings, analysts need to provide for the patient a simple, yielding relationship to their analyst environment. Through the simple, yielding primary object relationship, the patient is helped to free herself of complex, rigid, and oppressive forms of relationships to her objects that are ideologically related to her basic fault, and to start or discover simpler, less oppressive forms. In the harmonious transference-countertransference of the primary object relationship, and again, primary object relationship here referring to the cathexis of the analyst with the libido of primary love, sort of relating to the analyst in the mode of primary love. Patients become able, quote, able to shed all sorts of character and defensive armors and to feel that life had become simpler and truer. As mentioned earlier, at times in periods of the new beginning, the primary object relationship takes the form of a harmonious interpenetrating mix-up with a substance, not a person, and the analyst assumes the role of a primary substance, such as earth or water, in the transference-countertransference, becoming pliable, offering little resistance, and most importantly, proving indestructible. During these times, the environment analyst, quote, accepts and consents to sustain and carry the patient like the earth or the water sustains and carries a man who entrusts his weight to them. In contrast to ordinary objects, especially ordinary human objects, no action is expected from these primary objects or substances, yet they must be there and must, tacitly or explicitly, consent to be used. Otherwise, the patient cannot achieve any change. Without water, it is impossible to swim. Without earth, impossible to move on. The substance, the analyst, must not resist, must consent, must not give rise to too much friction, must accept and carry the patient for a while, must prove more or less indestructible, must not insist on maintaining harsh boundaries, but must allow the development of a kind of mix-up between the patient and himself. End quote. This kind of primary object relationship between the patient and the analyst, Balint notes, is often symbolically expressed through relaxed physical contact with the analyst, such as holding the analyst's hand or finger or touching her chair. Balint emphasizes the importance of reducing inequality in the relationship and mitigating at all costs the analyst's appearance of omnipotence. The analyst ought to strive to remain unobtrusive and ordinary. Her chief functions in the role of a primary object are recognizing and being with her patient. It is the analyst's presence rather than her activity that is most critical. Most important is that the patient feels her to be present and present at the right distance, not so far that the patient feels lost or abandoned, and not so close that she feels encumbered and unfree. He also suggests that it may be safer for the patient to use the analytic situation in toto as a transferential primary object to which they can cathect their primary love, rather than the person of the analyst specifically, which could give rise to malignant or other gratification-seeking forms of object relationship. Balint notes that analysts, like mothers, do not give primary love. Rather, they behave like primary objects by offering themselves to be cathected by primary love. It is in this primary object relationship that patients have the chance to heal off their basic fault by enacting their maladaptive coping methods in the transference-countertransference until they can, quote, discover the possibility of new forms of object relationship, experience them, and experiment with them. The new forms of object relationship, when the new beginning is successfully achieved, will inevitably be less defensive, less compulsive, more adaptive, and more flexible. The precondition for the establishment of benign regression to a primary object relationship of harmonious interpenetrating mix-up between self and environment is the provision of an object environment or analyst environment that is felt to be in no way demanding, interfering, or intruding. More than care, love, affection, attention, gratification, or protection, the analyst ought to aim to offer time and space that is free from extrinsic temptations, stimuli, and demands. Finally, the analyst must be both yielding and consistent, both flexible and stable, both present and unobtrusive. Quote, over and above all this, he must be there, must always be there, and must be indestructible, as are water and earth. And so now finally turning to how we can apply Balint to understanding the psychedelic cure. The comprehensive and novel theory Balint presents in the basic fault illuminates the therapeutic processes implicated in psychedelic therapy. Psychedelic mystical experiences, as described earlier, defined by a sense of profound oneness with the world, the loss of the sense of being a separate self, and a deeply felt sense of peace, joy, bliss, and tranquility, closely correspond to the harmonious, undifferentiated, interpenetrating mix-up of self and environment that Balint describes as the original primary state of the fetus in the womb, primary love. And given the rarity, transience, and precariousness with which such primitive regressed states occur in ordinary psychoanalytic treatment, the clinical significance of the opportunity offered by psychedelics to reliably induce such states for periods of many uninterrupted hours cannot be underestimated. Emerging from these mystical harmonious experiences, patients frequently report feeling reborn, expressing that the experience allowed them to shed old, rigid, maladaptive ways of thinking, behaving, and relating, and that they were able for the first time to know and embody their true self. Balint's theory helps us understand that psychedelics, therefore, have the capacity to temporarily return patients to the period of fetal or infantile primary love before primitive traumatic deficits, i.e., the basic fault, developed. Remember, the basic fault obtains following primitive experiences of trauma in a primary object relationship. It is therefore the discovery and re-imprinting in the experience of a harmonious primary object relationship of new forms of relating and new ways of being that heals off the basic fault and the maladaptive coping strategies or ways of being in the world that it comprises. Psychedelic occasioned regression to infantile or prenatal states of primary love allows the patient to correct or re-imprint maladaptive primary object experiences with the analyst. Maladaptive coping strategies and character traits associated with the basic fault can be relaxed, and new ones can be learned in the transference-countertransference of the therapeutic relationship, a new beginning. The value of psychedelics for psychoanalytic practice is psychedelics' capacity to reliably occasion the dissolution of ego boundaries and defensive structures, and subsequently, patients' subjectively immersive regression to the primitive, oceanic, undifferentiated state of harmonious mix-up with the object environment prior to the development of the coherent ego. During this experience, both the mind and the brain are unusually plastic, sensitive to learning, and vulnerable to adaptive revision and relational re-imprinting. Crucially, such re-imprinting takes place in the transference-countertransference of primary object relationship with the analyst. What is imprinted in the transference-countertransference may be new defensive organizations, object relation templates, or even character styles. The disillusion of the self that rigidly crystallized around the basic fault allows for the reintegration of a self with newfound flexibility, spontaneity, and agency. To finish with just a few brief comments on implications for technique. Technically, as Balint prescribes, psychedelic therapy as generally practiced today in research settings most often involves a therapeutic presence that is gentle, supportive, encouraging, ordinary, quiet, simple, unobtrusive, and yielding, while also strong, stable, reliable, and consistent. Patients typically spend most of their psychedelic sessions, which usually last 6 to 8 hours, wearing eye shades and listening to music. Adaptations to the typical psychoanalytic frame designed to promote patients' immersion in their inner experience during their psychedelic experience. While patients are turned inward, therapists are engaged in quietly but actively attending to and carrying or sustaining the patient's unfolding experience. Much of the time, the work of the therapists is simply to be there with the patient. Bill Richards writes, the healer's, quote, the healer's primary task may be understood as getting his or her ego out of the way and becoming fully present, as if focusing a beam of light that comes from beyond. The being of the therapist matters more than the words the therapist speaks, the actions offered, or the concepts employed to theoretically articulate what is occurring. The therapist is always available, but avoids impinging or intruding on the patient's experience. When necessary, such as in difficult, frightening, or overwhelming moments of the patient's experience, the therapist might intervene more actively, such as by offering a hand to hold. An intervention, if you remember, Balint also cautiously proposes, could sometimes be clinically indicated, or by gently but firmly encouraging the patient to courageously embrace and surrender to whatever it is they might be terrified to confront. it's imperative that analysts or therapists working with psychedelics have the competence and fortitude to contain the intense affects, memories, and fantasies that may emerge not only in the patient, but also in the analyst herself. Above all, the psychedelic therapist is there to be used as needed by the patient for comfort, for grounding, for contact, for recognition, for understanding, or simply to feel seen, held, and attended to. In all these relational and interpsychic interactions in the transference countertransference, uh, the patient uses the therapist in order to experiment with, play with, and discover new ways of being in relationship and in the world. What the patient needs, however, varies from moment to moment during a single psychedelic experience, from experience to experience during a course of psychedelic therapy, and of course, from patient to patient. The technique of psychedelic therapy may benefit from more deliberate attention paid to both the therapeutic and the pathogenic potentials of the intersubjective enacted dimensions of the transference countertransference. Though instinctive spontaneity often serves psychedelic therapists well in determining their interventions, careful consideration of the nature of the patient's psychodynamics, the role of the object relationship with the therapist, and the particulars of the transference countertransference and its vicissitudes, all of which critically contribute to determining both the unique course of the patient's treatment and the idiosyncratic content and processes that manifest in her psychedelic experiences, will refine the psychedelic therapist's choice and timing of interventions so as to best meet the patient's precise needs in any moment and most effectively promote the patient's healing. That's it. Thank you guys for listening.
Thank you so much for presenting. That was really fantastic. And I have to admit I haven't read the book, so I'm gonna have to now. Maybe it's gonna be one of the ones that will end up on the list of the study group for the clinic. Um, yeah, really, really fantastic. I've got a couple of questions myself, and there was one in the chat. So if anybody else has any, let me know as well. Uh, but I guess I would like to start. The thing is, the talk is so full that a lot of the questions that I was coming up with were being answered a little while later. So you've really done a fantastic job. Um, One thing that came to mind, thinking about this in terms of the clinic itself, where we deal with people after the fact, rather than guiding during, and how often the people that will come to us through the clinic will have had difficult experiences, uh, in the acute ingestion of the drug. Um, I'm sort of thinking, how does this idea of regression to a state of primary love account for bad trips? And does this model tell us anything about how to deal with post-psychedelic difficulties?
Yes, this paper is going to be coming out, I think, later this year in an issue of the International Journal of, oh, I don't remember what it's called, the International Journal of Controversial Issues or something like that. Um, anyway, I cut a lot for this reading, but one thing I summarized from the book, which obviously Balint discusses in much more detail than I summarize in the paper, is uh, pathogenic forms or malignant forms of regression. For today, I was sort of focusing on the therapeutic potential of when regression goes well, but he also discusses at length um, the the real risks of regression going wrong. And I wouldn't even say the risks, I would say the likelihood. I think he describes, he's not talking about psychedelics. He's talking about the kind of regression that occurs in, I guess, like typical psychoanalytic treatment. But he identifies a number of different factors or a number of different ways that the analyst can respond poorly to the patient's regression in a way that will lead to malignant, harmful forms of regression. And so arguably people who are having difficult experiences on psychedelics outside of clinical settings, something like that might be happening. There might be something in the environment that is, as they're regressing, is leading to yeah, he sort of describes a number of different forms of like what malignant regression can look like. But that's what I would imagine that maybe he would say might be happening with these people. And then in terms of how to deal with it after the fact, I guess it's an interesting question because when he's talking about malignant regression, again, he's sort of talking about that as the consequence of the analyst's poor handling of the regression. And so I think, if he's discussing how to address it, it's sort of already something that's happening it's happening in the relationship. And so then it's a matter of sort of fixing your own mistakes. And maybe it's a different question if somebody is coming in having had a harmful experience of regression separately from with the analyst. And maybe he would say that if that therapist or analyst can offer the conditions for an experience of benign regression, then that might be able to sort of undo or rework the malignant regression and its impact that the person had gone through. But
Yeah.
I mean, if that's your interest, I really recommend those passages in the book.
Mm. Yeah, thank you very much. Because I'm thinking that whether that's sort of facilitating an environment where if somebody turns up and they're in a regress state, whether that's about facilitating an environment where they can regress further towards this state of, primary love, or whether it's about creating a, environment where they might return from the regression before
Yeah, I
one
mean,
regresses further.
I guess sort of implicit in that question is um, whether it's the state of regression per se that's harmful or the uh, sort of its nature and impact, if that makes sense. Because if it's just being regressed per se that's harmful, then yeah, you would sort of want to help somebody put themselves back together. But Balint might argue that it's not so much the regressed state per se that's harmful, as rather the vulnerability of the person in the regressed state that renders them more open to like deeper forms of harm. But if you simply put together their ego again, that might only make the harm more concrete.
Mm, mm. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. I wonder if anybody else has one before I ask some of those.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh,
Connor?
Debbie's also unmuted. Do you want to go first, Debbie?
No, go.
Okay. Hi. Thanks, CJ. That was really interesting. I guess it feels what you're describing is like quite dyadic, like it's the therapist and the patient. But how would you speak to like group experiences where you've got like group ceremonies and you might not have one-to-one support, although you might receive some one-to-one care, I suppose, during that experience. But yeah, how would you speak to like people getting a benefit from being like in a group container rather than necessarily one-to-one support?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, I mean, for that, honestly, I would point you to a different paper of mine, which I published last year. It was a research study on um, people, adults who had been maltreated as children, who had been abused or neglected as children, who used psychedelics with therapeutic intent in naturalistic group settings. And so specifically, either in facilitated group ceremonies or at raves or other dance music events. Um, and in that paper, I go into some of the thinking about why group environments might be proving that, because I mean basically I found that it was, you know, highly therapeutic for most of the participants, and so I go into like why that might be. Um, and I think the mechanisms are distinct from like specifically what Balint is talking about in terms of, like you said, like the two persons primary object relationship, that I think can, at least, you know, that he argues can rework really primitive traumas. But I also think that there are parallel mechanisms at play um, in terms of a person not just themselves being in uh, you know, a regressed, sort of unboundaried, emotionally open psychical space, but also being in that space with other people who are in that space as well. Um, so sharing an experience of you know, emotional intensity of you know, unique or like kind of exceptional vulnerability. Um, but then also part of why I focus specifically on ceremonies and raves is because these are also you know, sort of distinct and coherent subcultures that have ethical norms and social norms. They have cultures that promote interpersonal connection. They promote attitudes of non-judgment and acceptance and love and togetherness. And so having you know, particularly if somebody has an experience of you know, a history of maltreatment, and they maybe tend to feel very disconnected and isolated in relationships, being in a group where there's a particular culture of promoting connection and togetherness and emotional expression, emotional vulnerability. Um, in the you know, we can call it regressed or, you know, plastic, unboundaried state of the psychedelic experience. Again, I do think that there's a mechanism of re-imprinting, of having you know, sort of healing, therapeutic, new relational experiences that can you might say overwrite, or you might say update you know, maladaptive models from early childhood.
Yeah, I'd love to read the paper.
While somebody's thinking of the next question, I'll just pull it up and put it in the chat.
Debbie?
I just wanted to say thank you. I didn't really have a question, but just a reflection. I was thinking about my client that I just had a lot of difficulties with, Timmy, you know who I'm talking about. And I was just thinking, for me anyway, the way that you've described of just being, of just holding, one of the most important things for me was taking a position somehow of something to keep myself together. But ultimately, I didn't really feel that I had so much to do or say except to just be. And I guess I just want to say thank you so much, because it's like you've given words to the experience that I had that I didn't have before, which is really, really helpful. And like Timmy, I'm very excited now to read the book. I've got it next to me, but I hadn't read it yet. So that's been a fantastic introduction. And thank you so much for the talk and for organizing to me.
Yeah, he's a beautiful writer. You know, I only gave the slightest taste, but he's a really beautiful writer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So we've got two more questions in the chat, and I've got one myself. Um, so perhaps we'll just go with those, and then we can close it out if you've got time for that. Um, um, so one of the
In
questions.
terms of, I'm fine on time, so I'll let you close it out.
Okay, perfect. Um, so one is about essentially prenatal trauma, and what effect this might have upon, the developing subject or developing ego. I guess, the model that you're putting forward is about a state prior to any ego development, and what effect, prenatal trauma might have at that level, and how this relates to the work of Groff with the basic perinatal matrices, and also he brings in these ideas of transpersonal regressions or transpersonal phenomena resulting from regressions. Um, I don't know if that's two separate questions or whether you want to combine them.
No, I think I see what the person's getting at. I mean, I hear the question as saying, like basically if Balint is saying that you heal early life traumas by regressing back before the trauma, then what if there's already trauma in the womb? Like, do you need to regress even further into like, past life regression? I think I don't know if I can say what Balint would say, but my take on Balint's theory is that it's not quite so literal as um I don't think regression is quite so literal, and I also don't think that the mechanisms at play that he's describing are quite so literal in the sense that like regression is like literally turning back the clock, and that you literally need to like turn back the clock far enough. I think it's more, and I'll also say, for what it's worth, I don't think that that's what psychedelics do. There was a paper by Karen Peoples and Megan Rundle that came out relatively recently in Psychoanalytic Dialogues, where they sort of critique the regression idea of explaining psychedelic experiences, and they say, we don't think that these are regressed states. Um, when I when I read that paper, I understood them to be critiquing this idea of like turning back the clock, and that's not exactly, at least that's not how I think about regression or psychedelic experiences, and that's not what I mean when I say that psychedelic experiences are regressed states. What I mean is that functionally, before the development of the ego, I think Balint is probably right that structurally there is not yet a developed membrane of the ego between the unconscious and the conscious and the external world. It's all a libidinal flux. And that's the psychical state that is regressed only in the sense that it's a primitive mental state. And with psychical development comes the development of the ego. But it's not literally like I'm going back to when, CJ was a 6 month old. And so I think the question in that sense, yeah, it's like if the baby, one critique of Balint or in general, not just Balint, but in generally of the idea that the womb is a kind of, harmonious paradise is just this, mothers experience stress and fetuses experience stress hormones and et cetera, et cetera. And so it's not, I don't think the idea or like the core of the idea is that the womb is literally a state of absolute harmony and that the mystical experience is literally dialing the clock back to this, sacred time in the womb. It's more about the structure of the mind at that point. Now, I mean, in terms of this question, arguably, if the baby is experiencing like gross traumas while in the womb, it could leave, even uh like more enduring harm than later once there's, ego and defenses develop. Um, but anyway, I can't speak to the question of regressing to past lives in this context.
I suppose it's kind of like concretizing the metaphor. Regression is not some literal thing, but when we think about the phenomenology of a psychedelic experience, where someone might find themselves feeling like they're fully reliving a memory, or being involved in something that has happened in their biography. Um, that then the regression can seem literal, but what you're saying is these sort of dissolution of defenses and more primitive states facilitates the emergence of this kind of material.
Precisely, precisely. It's functional regression in the sense that the psyche is structurally, functionally in a more primitive state. But I'm not like, literally, going back to when I was 3. It's just that, that experience has been, whatever you want to call it, dissociated, warded off, repressed, and the defensive structures of the ego are softer, more dissolved, and so these unformulated experiences are able to reach consciousness.
So I'll ask Russell's question in just a moment, but the other one that I had sort of leads on from this quite nicely. And again, you sort of addressed it briefly in the talk after I noted it down. But in this model, it seems like the content of the experiences seem less important than the experience of regression itself. And do you understand the phenomena then, or would Balint understand the phenomena as sort of mere irrelevant surface phenomena? Or do you think this theory could be supplemented for it to account for them? Does it already? What's the importance of the phenomenology?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I guess what I would say is I feel like a lot of the content type stuff um, that he might account for the therapeutic value of that, those are the kinds of like psychodynamic experiences that come up in psychoanalytic treatment anyway. Like, recovering memories, having, intense abreactions of affect, things like this. And what he's getting at is that the basic fault is at this even deeper sort of procedural level, that can only be reworked in the context of regression, in the context of a primary object relationship. And so like in a psychedelic experience, the content it's not that it doesn't have therapeutic value. He's just pointing at a different dimension of the treatment process than what has already been, sort of widely known.
Sure, like what you were saying about this being an extension of Freudian theory rather than a replacement or something
Yeah,
like that.
yeah.
So Russell has asked, does the stance that Balin proposes potentially stimulate an erotic arousal of the patient towards the analyst that they may want to enact, particularly if touch and altered states combine?
I saw that question. I think kind of like with your question, I think Balint touches on that when he's discussing basically what can go wrong if the analyst doesn't respond well to the patient's regression, and that he would consider that like one of the different ways that it can go wrong.
I think perhaps that's a
Is Timmy frozen for everyone else
a
right now?
good place to wrap up.
Oh, there you are.
On my back.
Okay, okay. Yeah, that sounds great.
Sure. So yeah, if nobody has any more questions, thank you so much, CJ. It's a fantastic paper, and yeah, we'll be delighted to have you back if you ever want to present again.
Awesome. Thank you, Timmy, and thank you everyone for coming and for your questions.